exactly is excess regulation? My gosh, anything that makes you do what you don't want to do, So I'm pondering that, and then I got back to the office and we talked on the phone, and I asked that question, I think, and then we both we just sat there in silence for a while. But I immediately went to try to define this issue, and this is where I came out. And I had to go to a quote from Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart. I shall not today attempt to define. You guys can read that. I don't have to read it to you. Within that shorthand description, and perhaps I could never succeed in intelligibly doing so, but I know it when I see it. Now, y'all know what he was talking about, right? It was actually a case on obscenity laws. But maybe excess regulation fits right into that. We'll just substitute porn for excess regulation, and away we go. So I'm left, it's kind of hard to attack the issue if we can't define it, and that's one what I struggled with. And as I go through this, I'll talk about some of that. But I had to kind of go back and say, why do we do some of the things we do anyway? What we have done in terms of regulation. Part of it's just to define kind of the rules of the road of how markets are going to work. How do we allow markets to work? What's the behavior we're going to allow? We try to resolve a lot of market failures, whether it's public goods or externalities. Externalities is a good one. Why do you put the feedlot on the side of the hill? So everything runs down in the river, and it's not my problem anymore. So that's a good negative externality, which really deals with, do you bear the full cost of what you're producing? And then, of course, market power. We've done a lot with market power over the years, particularly in livestock. GIPSA, in Packers and Stockyards, that's sort of a basic fundamental law in terms of trying to resolve market failures. Lots on protecting consumers. We have a number of sources of regulation. How do we get some of this? Well, either industry asks for some of this. Can we do this? Can we do that? Can we create a law that allows us to do something? Could we have established bureaucratic interest in a regulation? One or more segments of society see a need. Both this and this, what I'm going to term non-government regulation, is really, I think, and I probably should have put these two little subheadings down here. I think that's the growing area. We can't avoid this, probably. Lean, fine textured beef? I'm going to avoid the other thing. Is that a regulation? At least why they're in the news now? Or is this more a source of interest group pressure and a non-government regulation where those companies decide not to do it after some consumer group pressure? So it really becomes, I think, kind of a regulation, but it's enforced by the market structure that we have, the companies there, and ultimately by some group of consumers. I tried to make a list of the types of regulations we deal with. I went to a bunch of different sources, farm programs, risk management stuff, conservation, environment, international trade, marketing, credit issues, food and nutrition, food safety, antitrust, labor, transportation, land use, feed additives, animal health. If I missed some category of regulation that we deal with, I got a book. It's called Policy Tools in Agriculture. We listed about 140 different individual tools in about 10 of these subheadings that are regulations or policies or government or tools that are used to affect or to regulate agricultural industries. I'm not sure we got a complete list there. We got 140. I guess we just got tired of writing. I know that I did. But so if we think about this, and I've left out a couple, I'm just going to call new types. Animal welfare. How much of that's regulation from our normal government thing, and how much is actually somebody else driving that or driving some kind of change? And then I also put in process certification or verification, like organic. Do you want to produce under that organic label that implies some kind of verification of how you do things so a consumer may see that process? So this is all just to take a couple minutes to try to focus some thoughts a little bit, in keeping in mind the notion of excess regulation. A couple of other issues. As an economist, are we seeing the cumulative effects of a lot of what seem to be very small regulations over time that just seem to build up? And so that we're getting some critical mass of regulations that forces major changes in how much we produce and how we produce and everything else. I don't know the answer to that. But it strikes me, in working on this little project, is that possible? Yeah. Some ideas seem to be a good idea, ought to be a law, ought to be this, ought to be that regulation, but over time does it build up to the point that it really becomes burdensome and so costly that it forces people out of business? So, are there unintended consequences of other policies? Heck yeah, ethanol, right? I don't think anybody went out in mind to require ethanol use because it was going to do to livestock what it did, right? Kind of unintended. Okay, costs of excessive regulation. Here's some of the things I found in working on this. Is basically a whole bunch of it is just plain pretty darn difficult to quantify. How much of it deals with paperwork, hassle, using your time, and then the difficulty as an economist trying to do that is how do you value your time, particularly as a producer, as a rancher. We run into this all the time. What dollars do you put on it? If we're going to develop a notion of analyzing the cost of regulation, a lot of these things deal with this, don't they? So how do we value someone's time? When it's pretty common in agriculture that is that actually an expense you put down, or do you have to work harder for what's left over at the end of the year? In essence, accept a lower rate of return in your operation because you're spending more of your time doing this stuff rather than stuff out on the ranch that needs to be done. Does that make sense? This becomes, I think, a real tough area to do, and is really a source of a lack of data, or, how do we cost some of these things out to try to get at a cost of regulation? I think that's pretty tough. Do we put something that says environmental compliance costs on the financial statement? Cost me this, this, and this. That makes it, if we can't quantify some of these costs, it's pretty difficult to do an economic analysis of what excess regulation costs us, or for that matter, any kind of regulation. Does that make sense? I think that's a real fundamental roadblock in doing some of this work. A couple other points is really the incidence of the costs. Who bears those costs to a new regulation? Who bears the costs and who gets the benefits? Isn't that what we fight about a lot, or one of our concerns is that production pays all the costs, but somebody else gets whatever benefits there? Or, if there is any benefits. In fact, Greg and I talked, I said, can I talk about benefits? Or do we not want to talk about benefits or regulation? We only want to talk about costs, really? I think. But, I'm certainly guilty of that, forgetting that there's benefits. I teach a graduate course in ag policy, and I do things on cost of regulation, the economics of regulation, as something beyond your basic commodity policies. But we tend to talk a lot about the economics of cost or regulation, or that regulation burden, but we often don't talk about benefits. So I fall into that same trap in planning for this. You suppose there are regulations that cause costs, but there's no benefits? That might be a good definition of excess regulation. Or where benefits are less than costs. Again, who gets the benefits, who pays the costs? I started digging through kind of the economic literature. I was pretty disappointed with what I found in terms of the literature in ag economics, or in economics dealing with agriculture, on trying to get at a cost of regulation, or what portion of our production costs in agriculture are caused by regulation. There's a lot of studies on individual regulations, particularly dealing with lobbying or fighting some regulation that's coming down the road, where you get some study and it says it's going to cost the industry X number of dollars, this many lost jobs. Most of those are cost focused, but again are dealing with as that law comes forward, or as that bill, or as it's being implemented. I think COOL is a good example of that. I was involved in doing some of those myself. What's the cost of COOL? What's it going to cost the industry when it's implemented? There is some work on HACCP, and some economic studies that were done, as some time passed, and basically what do they show? Hey, we got fewer meat packers than we used to. Costs are higher. And those costs are not size neutral. We lost a lot of small packers who couldn't bear the cost of adopting those regulations and things. One of the real lacking areas is a lack of follow-up on the actual effects or impacts. We may fight over some issue or whatever, but then we all move on to the next thing, and we never go back and look to see, did it really cost us this much? Or how has it changed the industry? I think that's a real lacking area, so I was pretty disappointed in what I found. So I'm going to take a shot at a little bit of analysis. I've done some work on kind of an econometric model of the sheep industry. I'm basically going to use in economic terms what we call an equilibrium displacement model. In looking through the literature on other livestock industries, other industries, essentially, if we boil it all down, if we have a cost increase, they essentially come out with a very small impact on production. So if we get a 1% change in cost or a 10% change in cost, the effect on production is actually smaller than that. Smaller than that 1%. We might say it's very inelastic if we were going to use economic terms. But we also deal in agriculture with demand that is also inelastic in nature, meaning a small change in production gives you a lot bigger change in price. If you work through that, one of the things you find is, or I'm going to suggest, is that increasing costs result in sort of small production changes, but they result in larger price changes. Well, let's just do this. I got two scenarios. One, I'm going to increase costs by 1%. One I used a couple years ago at the animal science meetings about eliminating public land grazing for lamb. What I did was I kind of worked through this, and basically for a 1% increase in costs, I got about a 0.2% decline in number of ewes, 0.2% decline in production, an increase in imported lamb, and about a 0.4% increase in the lamb price. So costs result in less production and higher price. What's the response to higher prices? One is consumers eat less. Yeah, they eat chicken. But also, there's a production response down the road to a higher price. So one of the things that happens is, as we look at some of these things, I think we lose the effect of regulation economically because we see this lower production, but then we also see higher prices in response to that, and it all has to do with the nature of the demand for agricultural products. So I think it's hard. It becomes even harder to sort out some of the effects of excess production. Grazing loss, basically, I assume we lose 25% of the ewes from that. And so this is more, instead of going back and looking at costs, this is more of a projecting forward thing about the cost of regulation in terms of less production, fewer sheep, more imports, and a higher lamb price. Does it matter where in the system, farm, wholesale, retail, where those regulations are imposed? In general, I'm going to just talk about farm, wholesale, and retail in a series of effects. We get a new regulation that increases costs at this farm level. So the effect on costs is costs go up, right? We produce less because we're less profitable, costs are higher, so we get the little negative sign there. If we produce less, what happens to our price that we get? For those survivors in the industry, because we don't get all just hold hands and decide we'll all cut back the same amount, and that way we all get to carry on. And what happens? Some people go out of business. That's how we cut production. The higher cost producers go out of business. That cutting of supply then leads to higher farm level prices, higher wholesale. If we think of wholesale, meat price at the wholesale level, cut out, if you will, and then higher retail prices. If we impose those, if it's a cost at the wholesale level, let's say meat packer level, costs go up. Result is they start producing less, but they produce less by buying fewer animals from farmers. That resulting loss of demand means that farm level prices go down. As we produce less, retail prices go up, prices farmer gets go down. And same thing at the retail level, where you see lower prices at the farm level and wholesale level, but higher retail prices. That makes sense a little bit if you think about the direction of the effects that we ought to see through the supply chain from various regulation. In class, we do a lot of graphical stuff, which I won't put anybody here through. But we talk about examples at every one of these levels of changing regulations, changing costs, and improving technology and things, and how they affect that supply chain. So all of those are important issues. I'm going to end with one more quote. I ran across this a long time ago. I've sort of kept the publication with me. And basically, Cattlemen have witnessed a proliferation of regulations which producers claim to have hampered efficiency and increased cost to consumers. The beef industry and the entire food industry may be suffering from regulatory overkill. Anybody remember Congressman Pope from Texas? He was the chairman of the House Ag Committee in the 1970s, kind of in the early mid-70s. He commissioned he as chair of the House Ag Committee, asked CAST to do a report entitled Impact of Government Regulations on the Beef Industry. It came out in 1979, and it does a qualitative assessment of about 84, 85 different regulations affecting the livestock industry. In fact, you can see in there a kind of an assessment of stuff like, they were kind of ahead of their time in a way. They talked about stuff like animal ID, cool, a whole bunch of things in there in terms of a qualitative assessment, in terms of whether it had a positive or negative effect on producers, processors, retailers, and consumers in an economics term, overall social welfare. Are we better off from these different regulations? It's really kind of an interesting report. I happened on it just by chance a couple years ago because we were moving to a new building and a lot of stuff was going in the trash, and I happened to run across it, so I've held on to it. In fact, I brought the copy with me if anybody wants to see it. But, for 40 years now, it's basically regulatory overkill, so we're still kind of talking about that. Has it got any lighter? What's the cost impact of excess regulation? I don't know. You don't get too many economists say stuff like that, right? A couple things, though. In terms of some regulation, it's very difficult to reap the benefits of those unless there's demand growth from that product, unless there's demand growth from consumers because of the product they're seeing, particularly on those types of regulations that deal with whether it's consumer interests. It also strikes me, one of the good things, and we talked about this on the phone, is I said, what if I don't find a study out there that has some number we can put on it? To me, that's sort of a clue that there's probably a need for some work on that to actually quantify some of those things. I think one of the things that's lacking out there is that there really isn't a good set of research on what those costs really are, how they do affect the industry, and who's, are we seeing any benefits from some of the levels, from some regulation that we have, and sorting out some that may be very beneficial and some that may not be.